Hi, guys. Welcome to the So Thanks Mom podcast, where we talk about our parents, our parenting, and everything in between. I'm Jess.
I'm Allison.
And today we are going to be talking about our teen years, how we were raised differently, but why we're raising our children the same today. So let's jump right into it.
I was raised with old school parenting my entire life and had tumultuous teenage existence, to say the least. It was not easy at all. And then when I started parenting, I've never read parenting books. I've never done any of that. But when I started parenting and my kids would have tough moments, it would literally take me back to when I had those moments with my parents, and I would truly usually do the opposite of what they did with me because I know how it affected me and my relationship with them. And that's how all of this started. And like you, when I got on TikTok, I didn't know it was called respectful parenting at all. Like that was a whole new world when I got on here. But,
yeah, I didn't know about gentle parenting either. I didn't know that that was what it was called. I hadn't heard of it, but I had told stories about my childhood and my mom, and then somebody made a video about being raised with gentle parenting, and I got tagged in it so many times. Yeah. And I was like, oh, yeah, that was me too.
Did both of your parents use respectful parenting, or was it just your mom?
So it was mostly, I feel bad saying this because my dad was a really good example of somebody who just kept putting in the work, who just kept showing up, who learned along the way. Right. And the reason I talk about my mom so much more is because in the difficult moments, and for me, there was many difficult moments with me. My mom always took the lead. Yeah. Or was the one who handled them, And so I do talk about my mom a lot more for that particular reason. Right. But my dad is a really good example of somebody who just kept showing up and doing better. And he apologized. There was a lot of apologies. There was a lot of doing better the next time. And then, even to this day, he still continues to take steps towards that direction, especially, with my own kids. And we spend a lot of time with my parents. So he's a really good example of somebody who learned along the way.
And see, I love that because when I never heard an apology from my parents with my mom. I'm not going to talk about her personal stuff, but she struggled a lot with depression and things like that. So my entire childhood, I really only remember my dad. He coached the basketball team and the softball team, and he showed up to everything, every school event. He was always there. But he didn't show his love with apologies. He'd be like, let's go get a milkshake. Let's go do whatever. And they were still in that old school mindset of, I said it, you do it. And when you become a teenager and you start getting older, that you don't want to hear that. You want to hear, you want to be heard. And I was never heard because my parents would always speak over me, especially my dad, because he's old school Italian. And that's just, kids didn't talk. They didn't have a voice. And I grew up like that. And what it did when I started getting into my teenage years, it made me not tell them anything. Not tell them anything, lie to them, sneak out, do all kinds of bad stuff. My parents had no clue what I was doing, ever. And I think that's a big difference with this parenting. Do my kids tell me everything? No, nobody tells everything, but they come to me with the tough stuff with friendships and relationships and their relationships with each other. And I always wanted that. I always wish that I had that. My siblings and I, it was tough. It was very tough.
And I did have so much of that, with my mom. I told her literally everything, all the time, because when you're safe with somebody, when you know that they won't judge you. And it's funny now because even some of the stuff that I told my mom, she never reacted to anything. She never got angry or whatever. And we were talking about one thing in particular. And she was like, I remember you saying that to me and me just sitting there I can't believe my daughter just said that out loud.
Tell me everything, Jess. And that's how it is with my kids. I can remember being a teenager and watching how my girlfriends were with their moms, had cute little fun shopping days or could talk to them about boyfriends. I turned into a different person around my parents. When I would come home, or even if I was home alone and I would see my parents pulling up, I changed because I knew who I had to be in front of them. And it was so exhausting. And because I had to be someone else when I was around them, it led us to not have a good relationship because I was building resentment I didn't feel at home in my home. I didn't feel like my room was mine. I felt like they were the parents over here. I was the kid over here because my siblings were much older, so they were already out of the house. It just felt very separate. It never felt like we were a unit. It felt like them against me.
Yeah.
That's how it always felt. And that was a really lonely feeling, and it made me angry.
Yeah.
I was very angry. Even though I love my parents deeply, because I really believe they did everything they knew to do, because neither one of them had great examples as parents. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was really hard. And I never wanted that for my girls. I always wanted them to feel comfortable talking to me, even if it was a difficult conversation. And even that, sometimes they text me. Sometimes they don't want to talk and do it face to face because it's a difficult, and that's okay. You can text, you can write me a letter, you can do it when you're ready. But my parents would attack it like, I want to know what's going on and you're going to tell me right now. And it just made me feel defeated. It made me feel completely defeated.
And you know what's something that's interesting about like you and your relationship with your girls that I specifically remember about like my relationship with my mom? Because one of the biggest misconceptions that I think people have is that like the kids that are gentle parented are the ones who like cuss their parents out, like that you see in public, that have no respect for their parents. And I was a teenager, and I remember like one year for Christmas, because so I wrote a lot. My mom like always encouraged me to write because I had so many. And one year for Christmas, like I didn't have any money or anything, but I wanted to like get my mom something really nice. So I wrote her this like long letter about like how much she meant to me and how like appreciative I was of her. And like that was me as a teenager. Like that was my thoughts and feelings towards my mom as a teen, which is completely opposite of what I keep hearing people say is how they picture these like parented teenagers. And I'm like, no, we were close, and we're still so close.
Yep.
And my kids are close, and my whole family's close. And you know it, and similarly to how you remember like being difficult, and that's why you have so much empathy for your kids. It's similar for me, as I was very difficult in a lot of ways. And it gives me a lot of insight as to why kids might behave a certain way and what's actually going on. And like the last thing that you want to do, understand that, is punish them for struggling. And I wasn't punished for struggling, which was very different back then. That's
like, funny you said that, because one of my favorite gifts from my teenagers, I think it was like 3 years ago, they made me this jar. I still have it downstairs. And they put 100 things that they loved about me in it, wrote it on paper. And it was the sweetest. It touched me so much because I felt those things for my mom, but I had so much resentment. I didn't want to tell her. Like I was so angry at them. I didn't want to be nice. I didn't want to help. I didn't want to help them with the groceries. I didn't want to do any of that because I was so angry all the time. And not that my kids don't get irritated with me, but they don't raise their voice to me. They don't, and I don't do that to them. I didn't do that to them. You know, when I had my dad yelling at me all the time for stuff and trying to intimidate me into listening, it hurt me. When you have someone you love so much not trying to understand but yelling at you, and I can picture my dad's face now as like a tween and a teen and him screaming at me. It literally would break my heart. And I was like, I'm never doing that to my kids. And I really feel like because I treated them with respect, they treat me that way too. We don't have arguments. Of course they get on each other's nerves because they're teenagers, but they handle it so well. Like they're doing things now at 16, 17, 18, I couldn't do till I was almost 30, honestly, in relationships and calming myself and all of that. It's funny that you mentioned that too, is because so when I was like in college, my parents went through a really hard time, and my mom went through a really hard time, specifically. Well, they both did, but I remember feeling like she was like so different, you know, like she was, and the way that I responded to her was with anger too. Like I was like, oh God, like you're so difficult to be, you know, like I was like exactly how you're explaining it, because you know not every single moment is rainbow and butterflies. And me and my mom got along so well. There was like so much laughter and all of that, but we fought a few times, you know, like nobody's perfect. And you know, even to this day we still fight here and there, but the thing is that when you are safe with somebody, you can fight with them, you can argue with them, and you can know that it's not going to affect your relationship. That it's not going to make
like, it's not going to be held against you later.
Right.
It's
Thrown in your face.
not going to be thrown in your face. And you know that nobody's going to be taking like these horrible, toxic, low blows. Like, you really just are going to have an argument and move on and make up, and it's going to be okay. Um, and I think that's another thing that people think, it's like, oh, come on, it's not really like great all the time. And it's like, yeah, but the thing is that when it's not great, it's not toxic either.
Right.
And
Exactly.
it is healthy to be able to argue and still feel safe
and argue in a healthy way too. I just had one of my children had asked me something that I was adamantly against. Like, I knew I wasn't having it. I did not respond well. I usually really think before I respond, but this time I didn't. I was like, girl, what are you thinking? Like, that's what I said. And I was like, I should not have said that. And she was upset. So I texted her, I said, I am so sorry that I reacted that way. I was just very shocked when you asked me that. And it concerned me, you know, and we talked through it. And by the end of the text, it was, I love you too. And it was fine. But I was never afforded that opportunity, because when my parents were over it, I was supposed to be over it. And when you have someone screaming at you or berating you or doing that, I wasn't always over it when they were. So the next day, if I was in a bad mood, they would really, what's wrong with you? You have another attitude, your stomach hurts again? Well, yeah, because I've been upset, but they were over it and I was expected to be. And I don't do that with my kids. If they're still irritated with each other or something else or whatever, everyone digests those kinds of things differently and in their time. And I took a little bit longer. I took longer than they did. And I think that's another thing when you're dealing with a parent with a mental health issue or trauma or whatever it is. Sometimes you don't know what you're going to get from them. So like if I went to my mom and said, hey, can I stay at so-and-so's house on Friday? She might say no that time. Why would you even ask? You didn't do this. Or the next time she might be like, yes, oh, go have fun. You're going to a sleepover. I never knew which one I was going to get. And that left me learning to walk on eggshells and also like evaluating people's moods before I even did anything. And that was a really unsafe feeling.
Yeah.
You're always trying to like feel them out before you say anything. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That was difficult.
Yeah. And I think for me too, like, so my dad was more reactive than my mom, definitely like initially more reactive. But the thing about my dad is the thing that he did really, really well is like, my mom is my dad's favorite person in this whole world. Like he really is.
Yeah.
So, she really is. So he always respected the way that my mom did things, even though it was so different than how he was raised. And my dad, in a way, is very much a cycle breaker. You know, he grew up with a house with just screaming all the time. And he said, you know, he always knew when his parents were home from work because he could be down the block and he heard them screaming at each other. And he said, you know, his sister and him lived in a house and they didn't see each other for 3 years because as soon as they walked in, they just went right to their rooms and shut the door. So like they lived together, but they didn't even talk for like 3 years. Nobody saw each other. And he and my mom, he never yelled, like there was none of that in my house. There was like yelling or name calling. He never put my mom down, like ever. There was nothing like that. And yelling is such a big, loud noises are such a big thing for him. Like it immediately, like he's so tense. Like
that's how I get too. I remember my grandparents came over from Italy, and I can remember my dad telling me a story. He had done something bad. He was one of 5 and he was running from my grandfather because my grandfather would whoop him like pretty badly, brutally. And he's like, I ran in the backyard and I climbed up a tree and I sat there and I was like, you can't get me now. My grandfather grabbed a lawn chair and sat under the tree and waited, you know, for him to come down. So I understood my dad being raised that way, why he thought yelling at me would work. But I also thought, you see it's not working. You see it's not working. You see your child is not reacting to it. And I'm really struggling. I was struggling in school. I was struggling with choices I was making. Like to me as a parent, that's the part I don't get, is if you see what you're doing isn't working, that doesn't mean fix the child. That's a family dynamic issue. And I think that's where a lot of parents don't make the best choices, I guess, because it was blamed on me. Like, fix her, she's the bad one, she's this, when really It was the entire dynamic of the family. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, and we know that statistically to be true,
Yeah.
because if you look at statistics for kids who have problematic behaviors in school and you send those kids to therapy, whether or not those problematic behaviors continue, actually depends so much more on whether or not the parents went to therapy too.
Yes.
Because the results are pretty negligible between a child who has, like disciplinary issues or problematic behaviors going to therapy or not going to therapy. But if the parent goes to therapy,
Yep.
the parents go to therapy either on their own or together, the results are astronomically different.
Yeah.
Because it always, there's always that component, is that it's not just, you don't just have this problem kid, and I've said this a million times, no problem child ever wanted that role.
No.
But if you feel that you have no other options and that's the role that was handed to you, at some point you're going to embrace it.
Yes.
If you feel like this is who I am, this is who you think I am, and this is all I'm ever going to be, you're going to be like, deal with it, live with it. That's who I am.
That's exactly what I did. That is exactly what I did, because I got to a point where I was just like, I'm never going to be what they want me to be. I'm never going to be my brother. I'm never going to be this. And I was like, I give up. I just totally gave up. But it was always, I was the issue. And I can't tell you how many times I would argue with my parents and then go up in my room and cry, because I didn't want to do that. I did not want to yell. I did not want to be disrespectful or whatever. And I would go up in my room and cry. And my parents are like, you're crying because you feel shame about what you did. I was crying because not only did I feel bad, but I loved them. I didn't want to argue with them. I just wanted them to just let me speak, And I was never allowed to. And so what happens when you have a child that's starting to spiral too, when you only support the child in the ways you're willing to and not supporting them in the ways they need, it's not going to work. They never said, what do you need? What can we do? What can we change? It was always, you need to change this. You need to stop that. You need to do that. And there was so much pressure on me, and I knew I was hurting my parents, but I was hurting too. And I was a child that had never navigated any of that. You know what I mean? I had so much resentment. I could remember my mom, I had built so much resentment up by the time I was like 15. My mom would ask me to do a simple thing and I'd be like, and like just do the bare minimum. I wanted to do nothing because I was so angry, but I loved her, but I was angry. It was a really, really difficult time. It was really hard.
Yeah. And I think that's another thing. So my mom was always trying to find ways to help me. Like it was never about punishing me. And, and I did have some things that continued way longer than like would be considered age appropriate, and I've talked about that so many times. And a lot of people think that like, oh, well, then your mom didn't handle it the right way if you were still acting that way. But the thing is there's a very big difference between understanding that the way that you're acting is not the way that other kids are acting or is not age appropriate, and having the skills and tools to be able to act in a way that is. And so that's what my mom was always focused on was, okay, she can't clean her room. Why isn't she cleaning her room? How can we help her to clean her room? It was never about like, you didn't clean your room. Like she never took anything as like a personal attack to her or like, you know what I mean? It was always about how, and my sister went through a really hard time as a teen. She had to move schools, left her friends. She tore her ACL, couldn't play sports. And sports was her whole identity at that point in time. And she went through a really hard time because she had just moved from a place that she loved. She was having trouble making friends because she couldn't do it in the way that she wanted, which was always through sports. Yeah. And the one thing that she loved the most was just taken from her. And she went through a really hard time as a teen. And so she lashed out a lot. And she was traditionally, in our family, the much easier kid, in all the ways. She didn't struggle with executive function. She didn't have sleep issues. She didn't have, but as a teen, she really started struggling. And my mom always said that she was like, I always just felt so bad for her. Oh. And she did like, there was quite a few explosive moments because she was angry. She was, hurting and it was never held against her. Nobody's ever brought it up,
And that is so important. That is so important because I had things thrown in my face that I did, like say I was on doing really well. Like I had been going to counseling, doing everything. I've been doing well. And I would have one moment where I really struggled or had a little tiff with my mom, whatever it was. And all of my past behaviors would be brought up and thrown in my face, or a bad choice. And when you do that over and over, I loved softball. I loved basketball. I loved art. I quit doing all of that because I started seeking out different friends that were not good friends because I was just looking for something to make me not feel that way, I think. But throwing something in someone's face, especially as a teenager who hasn't navigated stuff like that, it's cruel. It's cruel to do that.
And I think a lot of times parents will unintentionally take a kid's behavior and take it personally and take it as an attack on them. And then they respond as if they're being attacked by their child, like as if it's intentionally destructive to them as a person, that they're malicious, when it's not. A lot of times it has to do with the child struggling on their own. And I think that's one of the things that my mom always recognized, that none of these things were malicious. None of these things were against her, or, it wasn't, well, I do all this for you and how could you do this to me because I did this, and it was, what they're like she said, she always just felt so bad for her because she was hurting. And every time my sister would have an explosive, thing happen, and my mom would go to talk to her, she was like, it literally broke my heart. She'd be crying. She didn't want to do that. She didn't want to act like that, And eventually it just kind of stopped. All the things that were hurting and that you were working through didn't continue. And it does for a lot of families because they turn it into the child's personality. They turn it into this momentous thing that now the child can't overcome it. They can't do better because even when they do better, they're punished for doing better. It's like, well, finally you could have been acting like that the whole time. And it's like, well, I am acting like that now. So why are you mad at me again?
That reminds me of, this is the first time I knew I had a problem with reactiveness from my ADHD and anxiety. I think I had told this story before, but I went to North Carolina with my family on vacation. We're shopping and the shops were super crowded. My mom's like, let's go get a t-shirt, blah, blah, blah. And I go in the shop and there were so many people and so much noise. And we had been at the beach and I didn't know I was having a panic attack, but I could feel like something happening. And I just grabbed a shirt and I said, Mom, can we please leave? I don't feel good. And she's like, you never feel good. She's like, this isn't just about you. You want to leave because you got your t-shirt and you're being selfish. And when she said that to me, it hurt me so bad because I wasn't. I just felt my body needing to get out of the store. And so we stayed in there for like 20 more minutes. We go outside. By that time, I'm in full, nobody touch me. I'm overstimulated, leave me alone. And we get in the car, we're driving home and we go around a turn and her shoulder touched mine and I flipped. I was like, don't touch me. And I screamed and I got in trouble and I had zero control. Like I had zero control over that coming out of my mouth. I was just so overstimulated. And that was thrown in my face so much. Well, we can't take you shopping. Look how you acted last time. Are you sure you want to go in here? Remember what you did at the beach?
And it's so hard because as adults, we have control over those things much more than kids do. We have control over our environment. We understand what it is that we're feeling and we have the ability to react accordingly. And when our children are struggling in those ways, with overstimulation and sensory issues or overload, and they have never been taught what those things are or the communication to be able to express that that's what they're feeling, but they know that they're feeling something and it's bad, but
it's scary.
And it's scary and it's bad, but they don't have the skills to be able to tell us what that feeling is. And then if they do, they're punished for feeling that way, and they don't have the control over their environment to be able to get out of the place that's making them feel like that. You're set up for disaster, you're set up for failure, and then you're punished for failing. And that's something that I feel like I try to talk a lot about is why it's so important, like the connection with our kids, the communication with our kids. And if you have a kid in your home who you feel it, everything is a little bit harder with them. Everything feels more difficult with them. Start with the connection with that child versus because everybody wants to know the tools to make them behave differently. You don't get those tools through punishment and reward. You have to understand that child because they're lacking skills that they need, or they're struggling in a way that we don't realize.
And they're trying to figure it out too. You're both trying to figure it out. And we have to understand that kids aren't trying to give us a hard time. They're having a hard time. They're having a hard time. And if we as parents don't know what to do, how can we expect a little 7, 8, 10-year-old to know how to tell us how they're feeling when we're struggling to connect? You know what I mean? But I think that's so true. When we punish behaviors, especially when the child doesn't have other options on how to communicate, like you said, or tell you what's going on, or really understand themselves, it's just, it's hurtful. And it feels like you're punished for being you. It feels like when you're your authentic self, you're punished because you're too loud, or you don't like crowds, or you want to sit in a certain seat at the restaurant, whatever it is.
And that doesn't mean that we let our kids walk all over us, or they just get to act a fool because they didn't get a toy that they wanted, or what, you know what I mean?
Right.
It's two totally different things that I feel like people oftentimes will try to make into the same thing, to demonize the idea of respecting your kids. Or to villainize it, but it's two totally different things, because I'm many things as a parent. I am not a pushover. I am
neither.
Right. But there's when you are connected with your kids, when you understand your kids, it's about giving them skills and tools to cope with the things and if there are behaviors that are not acceptable, regardless of where they're coming from, it's not about punishing them. It's about giving skills and tools to cope with them.
And replacing the behaviors.
Right. Yeah. Because the idea is not to just, become completely permissive, and it's never going to be that way. But I do remember when you're talking about panic attacks, I've told that story many times about me having a panic attack my freshman year of high school. And, so many people were like, oh, I never would have put up with that, blah, 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 blah. And I talked to my mom about that. And she was like, the thing is, though, is like when you know your kids really well, and you know that something is not right with them, and you know that something bigger is happening, then this isn't just a kid who wants to skip a test. Something a lot more is happening.
Yes.
And when you know your kid well enough, then you react, you act different.
That's exactly what it is, Jess. That's exactly what it is. It's just like, all of my two oldest are adopted. My youngest is my biological. They all have, sorry, I just got a thing that said your meeting's ending. We all have struggles, but it's also, like you said, if you see your child thriving and being a good friend and working hard and doing all, like they're well-rounded and they're doing really great things, and they have a bad day, that bad day doesn't wipe away everything else that they've done or that they have worked towards. They're just having a hard time, or it might be a hard week or a hard month or whatever, but that doesn't negate everything else good that they've done. And I feel like a lot of times when a kid starts having a hard time, parents forget everybody has hard times. Nobody's perfect. And I think also getting the idea out of your mind that obedience is your first goal. I said it, you do it. I had to get that out of my head, because when you're raised that way, that's how I planned to parent, because that's all I knew. But I had to replace that with, I want mutual respect between me and my children, so they feel safe coming to me in the tough moments and not talking to another 13-year-old for advice. I want them to feel safe coming to me with stuff. And that's not their job to facilitate that. That's mine. That's my job as a parent, to make them feel safe being able to come talk to me and do all that.
Right. And that's another thing that, like, so I grew up with gentle parenting, but that doesn't mean that I didn't make mistakes, that I didn't, do things that, looking back, I wouldn't have done it that way. Right.
Yeah.
But the first person that I always went to was my mom. The first, if I made a mistake, if I needed help with something, and everybody said, a lot of people will kind of be like, well, you should have done it in the first place. So like, okay, great. But like, nobody is free of making mistakes, but it's what do you do afterwards?
Yes.
How do you take accountability? How do you, and what do you do moving forward? And
Yeah.
when you have somebody to help you guide that, when you're a young adult, when you're a teenager, makes a world of difference, because
Absolutely.
teenagers are going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
They're going, and everybody is, not just
Yeah.
teenagers, but most often teenagers will rely on other teenagers to help guide them through those. And
And
that's
it's dangerous. It put me in
dangerous.
so many dangerous situations because my parents had no idea what I was doing. I would say I'm going to Christine's and I'm really going to whoever's house.
Mhm.
And all of my information on friendships, relationships, sex, everything was from other teenagers. And that is, I was in so many dangerous situations where my parents had no clue. And I would have given anything to be able to go and get advice from my mom or from someone I felt safe with. And I had no one. I had no one to talk to but other teenagers. And that is, it was not fun. It was not fun. And I got in a lot of trouble. And looking back now, I honestly think all of that could have been partially avoided. I was still a little wild, but I think it could have been avoided by just them listening a little more than they talked. That's all I needed. I just needed them to listen and not be reactive. But because they were so reactive with everything, I did not feel safe being honest with them, because I knew if I told them, I would have to, please don't freak out. Can I tell you this? I would like be begging them, please don't freak out. And they would. How can you feel safe going to someone when you know you're going to be berated for it, you know?
Yeah. And then the other thing is, I still probably would have been a little wild. So that's another thing. So me, I'm a true extrovert, right? I was not going to go to college and not party, like not go to parties, not be around. But because my mom, you know, she would always talk to me. She told me stories about her. She was, you know, she told me it was never going to be like, oh, I went to college and I just, you know, sat in my dorm reading instead of going out with my friends or whatever, you know?
Yeah.
But she, you know, told me stories about her, and, you know, being able to talk through that and understanding, like, okay, if I go to parties, I'm not a bad kid. I'm not, you know, I'm not doing anything.
And her relating, she was relating to you. And that's so important with teenagers.
Yeah. And still being able to, for the most part, almost always make responsible choices because you had talked to somebody who, you know, told you their own stories and told you, and, you know, there is, you do feel more prepared for those things and protected.
Yeah.
You know,
and you knew if you did make a mistake or a bad choice, she was going to help you through it, not tell you, you're so irresponsible. How could you do that? You knew you were going to be met with someone that wanted to hear you and listen and help you through that stuff.
And it also helps you navigate situations or circumstances that you feel are difficult. So this is a quick good story about my dad. So I when I was in college, I had a coach that I just, you know, a lot of people can relate to the idea of having a coach that makes you hate the sport you loved, right? And I had I had that in college. I had a coach that just made me hate the sport that I loved for my entire life. I was a D1 athlete. I loved it. And he helped walk me through a conversation that I had with the coach about something that I thought was like, that I did not appreciate, didn't like, that I wanted to like confront. And my dad helped talk to me about, you know, ways to go about that. So, you know, yes, I'm handling the situation on my own. I also have guidance from somebody else. And I'm not just ignoring a situation that I didn't think was, you know,
appropriate,
appropriate or right. I was able to confront it with guidance on my own, in a sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I honestly think that is one of the main reasons why when we give our kids a voice and we teach them how to communicate and advocate for themselves, they will be in less unsafe situations because they won't just say, yes, sir, no, ma'am, because you're an adult, I'm going to do what you say. They can find their voice. And if they're uncomfortable or in an unsafe situation, they'll voice it. They won't cower and say, well, you're an adult, so I have to do anything you say, or you're my teacher, so I have to do anything you say. I think that's so important for kids to know that they can do those things and advocate for themselves. I see my kids do it when they were working at that job and it was toxic. My daughter was, you know, you're not going to speak to me that way. Don't yell at me. Like, because the manager was screaming at all the waitresses and stuff. Like, that was amazing.
And it's interesting that you say that because, you know, so many people will put up with toxic environments
Yes.
because, you know, toxicity or even violence and love have always
Yeah.
been intertwined with them in the,
Yes.
for their entire life. And they've also been told this idea that I'm doing this because I love you or because I
Yeah.
care about you. So
It
then
hurts me more than it hurts you.
right. Yes. So then you get into these toxic work environments, you know, and even just like leaving the personal relationship things aside,
Yeah.
because the statistics on that are clear, but you get into these toxic work environments and you have these bosses or, you know, these people who are supposed to be leading you, berating you, yelling at you, acting in a toxic way. And in their minds, they're okay with it because it
Yeah.
almost feels like, well, if they didn't care, they
They
wouldn't
wouldn't do it.
but there is a way to teach and guide without, you know, being abusive.
Yes, because that sets them up for, what does that set them up for? If we're yelling and spanking and punishing and berating, it's setting them up. We're teaching them what to expect. So we're setting them up to accept that from boyfriends or girlfriends or partners or someone else, to accept all those behaviors that they should be saying, you're not going to treat me that way. This relationship's over, or I'm walking out, or whatever the case may be. But it sets them up to accept way less than they deserve because they equate that with love, and it's not. So I think this is a good place to end. Thanks for hanging out, guys, and we'll see you next week.